There is a particular kind of quiet that descends over a room the moment someone does something catastrophically brave. Not the sharp silence after a fire alarm, not the held breath before a verdict. Something slower and colder, like the second before ice cracks beneath your weight and the whole world tips. Cecily Ward created that quiet at 11:43 on a Friday night inside the Fairmont Royal York's Imperial Ballroom, when she looked Prentice Galloway directly in the eye and told him, in front of his board of directors, his legal team, and every name that mattered on Bay Street, exactly what she thought of him. She had not planned to say a word. She never planned anything at these events beyond surviving 8 hours in the black catering uniform without ruining her last presentable pair of flats. What she had not planned for was what happened next. Cecily had been picking up weekend shifts with Prestige Catering since she was 22. Not by preference, by arithmetic. Her salary as a pharmaceutical technician at Toronto General paid well enough for one person living carefully. She was not one person living carefully. She was two people, herself and her brother Bram, and Bram's early onset multiple sclerosis did not care about OHIP coverage gaps. The medication his neurologist had finally approved after 14 months of appeals cost $2,300 a month out of pocket. The compassionate access application had been pending for 8 months. The landlord on their Scarborough apartment had sent the third notice in as many weeks. So on Friday night, Cecily wore black and carried champagne. The gala was technically a charity event, Galloway Med Group's annual fundraiser for the Hospital for Sick Children. Every year, the city's pharmaceutical elite gathered in the Royal York's largest ballroom and congratulated each other on their generosity while a string quartet played and servers like Cecily moved invisibly between them. She had worked this event twice before. She knew which guests drank too fast and which ones stared at her silver tray like it was something they'd personally earned. She had been wiping down a tall table near the east wall, mechanically and without thought, when the room changed. The change wasn't a sound, it was an absence of sound, of movement, of the ordinary ambient noise of 400 people performing wealth at each other. Prentice Galloway had crossed the room. She didn't look up immediately. She'd heard his name twice in the last hour, always in low tones, always carrying a slight deference at the edges. She had worked enough of these events to understand that when a man caused that kind of atmospheric shift simply by existing in a space, you did not make eye contact and you did not linger. You cleared the nearest glass and moved on. Prentice Galloway was not what she expected when she finally glanced across the room. He was younger than the photographs on the Med Group website, early 40s, maybe less, with the kind of angular face that suggested he'd stopped finding most things interesting a long time ago. He wore charcoal with a fine chalk stripe, no tie. He moved with a deliberate, unhurried economy that made the room tighten around him wherever he went. Not because he demanded attention, but because he consumed it. A kind of gravitational pull dressed in expensive wool. He stopped at a table near the south end of the ballroom. The men seated there straightened immediately, all except one. Walter Goss, Cecily recognized him, was the procurement coordinator at Toronto General who had helped her navigate Bram's compassionate access paperwork 3 months ago. A quiet, careful man with reading glasses perpetually pushed up on his forehead and a habit of apologizing before he'd even made an error. He was sitting very still now, a champagne flute abandoned in front of him, as one of Galloway's assistants leaned in and said something that drained the remaining color from his face. Prentice Galloway stood at the head of the table. He did not sit. He looked down at Goss with the particular patience of a man who had already decided the outcome of a conversation and was simply waiting for the other party to arrive at the same conclusion. His voice carried, not because he raised it, but because the room had gone quiet enough to let it. "Walk me through the error." Goss adjusted his glasses. "Mr. Galloway, I understand there was an issue with the contract renewal application." "Walk me through it." Same tone, same volume, the same complete absence of heat. The room had rotated toward them. 400 people, their conversations trailing off, their glasses pausing halfway to their mouths. A photographer near the stage had lifted his camera. "I filed the exemption request under the incorrect formulary code," Goss said. His voice was thin, a thread pulled too tight. "It was a clerical error. I've since corrected. It cost us the hospital contract in front of their board." Prentice's eyes didn't move. "Say the dollar value aloud." Goss blinked. "I'm sorry." "The value of the contract? Say it here." The silence had weight now. Cecily could feel it pressing against the back of her skull. She watched Goss's face. The way his jaw worked, the way his eyes scanned the room and found no rescue anywhere, in it, and something sharp rose in her chest. She had a name for what she was watching. She'd seen it before. in hospital waiting rooms, in the faces of people who had run out of leverage and knew it. Humiliation performed for an audience. Walter Goss had spent 3 hours on the phone with her in February, walking her through every form, every appeal, every bureaucratic crevice she could push into on Bram's behalf. He had done it because it was the right thing to do. He had done it on his lunch break. Cecily was not aware of setting her tray down. She was not aware of crossing the ballroom floor. She was only aware of the moment she stopped beside the table and looked at Prentice Galloway, who looked back at her with the slight calibrated attention of a man who could not quite categorize what he was seeing. Mr. Galloway. Her voice was steadier than she had any right to expect. He tilted his head a fraction. He did not speak. "There's a difference," Cecily said quietly, "between accountability and theater. Walter made a filing error. You brought 400 people here tonight in the name of a children's hospital." She held his gaze and did not blink. "And right now, the only thing you're raising awareness for is the size of your own ego." The photographer lowered his camera. No one at the table moved. One of Prentice's assistants took a half step forward, then stopped when Prentice raised 2 fingers from his side, a gesture so small it was barely a motion at all. Prentice studied her. His expression had not changed. His eyes, though, they had shifted, the way a landscape shifts when a cloud moves across the sun. Not anger, not wounded pride. Something she didn't have a word for yet. "Excuse me," he said, almost curious. "You heard me." Her palms were sweating. Her feet had gone completely numb inside her flats. "He has a clerical error. You have a camera and an audience. There's a room full of people watching you decide what kind of man you are tonight." For 4 seconds, she counted them, in the compressed, crystalline way you count things when you're about to fall. Prentice Galloway said nothing. Then he turned to the nearest member of his team. "Find out her name." He looked back at Cecily. "Don't leave." He walked Walter Goss quietly away from the table and said something she couldn't hear. Whatever it was, Goss's shoulders dropped 2 inches. He was escorted, not roughly, toward a side door. 2 minutes later, someone in a dark suit touched Cecily's elbow. Mr. Galloway would like a word. The suite on the 32nd floor was not what she had expected. She'd imagined a war room, papers everywhere, men with earpieces, the ambient pressure of serious money doing serious harm. Instead, it was a sitting room with bone-colored furniture and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the lights of the lake, and it was empty except for Prentice Galloway, who was standing at the window with his jacket off, holding a glass of water. He offered her one when she came in. She shook her head. "What's your name?" he asked. "Cecily Ward." He turned the glass slowly in his hand. "You're not a guest." "No." "Catering." "Pharmaceutical technician, technically. I pick up shifts on weekends." He was quiet for a moment, studying her the way she imagined he studied contracts, not looking for what was present, but for what was underneath. "You know who I am," he said. "Prentice Galloway, CEO of Galloway Med Group." She kept her voice even. "Your company controls roughly 40% of the hospital formulary contracts in Ontario. Your father built the company. You took over 6 months ago after he died." She paused. "I work in pharmaceutical dispensing. I've been reading your company's name on drug orders for 3 years." Something moved across his face, and Walter Goss. "He helped me navigate a compassionate access application for my brother." The words came out flat. She hadn't intended them to. "He spent his lunch breaks on the phone with me for 3 weeks. Prentice set the glass down. He turned to look at her fully, and there was something in that direct gaze that made the room feel smaller. Not threatening exactly, pressurized, like the air before a storm. "The application. Which drug?" She told him. He was quiet for long enough that she thought he wasn't going to respond. Then, "That's one of ours." "I know." "Pending review." 8 months. He picked up his phone. He dialed. She watched him, utterly baffled, as he said 3 quiet sentences into the receiver and ended the call. He looked back at her. "It'll be approved Monday. The cost comes from the Patient Assistance Fund. Your brother pays nothing." Cecily stared at him. The floor beneath her had not actually moved. It only felt that way. "Why?" she managed. Prentice crossed his arms over his chest. He looked at her with the expression of a man who had not quite made up his mind about something, which she suspected was not an expression he wore very often. "Because I have a problem," he said slowly, "and I think you might be the only person in this building capable of helping me solve it." He explained it with the economy of someone who had already discarded everything non-essential. His father had left him a company in organizational crisis. The board was fractured, 2 factions. one of which was attempting to force a governance review that would install an external oversight committee and effectively hand operational control to his uncle Neil Stroud, who had been inside the company for 15 years and had a particular interest in keeping certain things buried. To stall the review and hold his position, Prentice needed to present a civilian ethics liaison to the board within 3 weeks. Not a hired consultant, the board would see through that immediately. Someone with genuine independence. Someone who worked in the industry, had no financial stake, and could not be bought. Someone who had just dressed him down in front of 400 people and walked away standing. "I need 30 days, he said. 3 board meetings, 1 investor dinner. Speak honestly when you're asked a question. You already seem to have no difficulty with that last part." And in exchange, Cecily said, "You approve Bram's application." "Already done." She looked at him steadily. "You did that before I agreed." "Yes." "Why?" For the first time since she'd entered the room, something shifted behind his eyes. Not softness, something quieter than that. Like a door opened an inch. "Because," Prentice said, "it was the right thing to do." Cecily sat with that for a moment. Then she looked down at her hands, her raw, tired hands, her 3rd shift this week, the eviction notice folded in her coat pocket. 3 meetings, she said, 1 dinner. I speak honestly. That's the entire agreement. I won't tell your board what they want to hear. I would be exceptionally disappointed if you did. She exhaled. She thought of Bram awake at 2 in the morning on the bad days, trying not to make noise so she wouldn't hear him. She thought of Walter Goss, patient and careful, explaining the appeal process one more time. "All right," she said. Prentice looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "Get some sleep, Miss Ward. My assistant will be in touch in the morning." He said it like someone who hadn't slept properly in months and had quietly stopped expecting to. The board meeting was held in a glass tower on Bay Street that made Cecily feel like she'd been inserted into a document she hadn't proofread. She wore the only blazer she owned, charcoal, with a faint shine on the elbows, and sat 3 seats from Prentice at a table that could have comfortably accommodated a small municipal council. 11 board members. Of the 11, 4 had looked at her the way people look at something that has tracked mud onto a clean floor. The man to her left was Neil Stroud, broad-shouldered and impeccably dressed, with eyes that took inventory of a room before a word was spoken. He smiled when they were introduced. The smile didn't touch anything above his mouth. "A pharmaceutical technician," Stroud said pleasantly. "How refreshing. We've always sourced our ethical guidance from within the sector before. Tell me, Miss Ward, how does someone with your institutional access provide meaningful oversight at this scale?" The room waited. Cecily set her pen down, the same way a patient advocate does. "I know what the supply chain looks like from the dispensing end. I know which formulary delays cause real harm because I've watched them happen in real time." She looked at Stroud directly. "I also know when a question is designed to make someone feel small rather than gather information. That one was the second kind." At the head of the table, Prentice said nothing, but she saw his jaw shift very slightly, in a way she was beginning to recognize. The investor dinner was on a Thursday. She wore a dress Prentice's assistant had arranged, navy, simple, expensive in a way she would never have chosen herself. The room was smaller than the gala, more deliberately curated, and Stroud was there again, seated across from her with a glass of Bordeaux and the air of a man who had already decided how the evening would end. He did it deftly, through misdirection and studied condescension. Questions about her educational background, her professional certifications, a gentle but pointed observation that civilian ethics liaisons were typically sourced through accredited institutional programs. He said all of it pleasantly, in the tone of a man making helpful observations. Cecily ate her salad and listened, then she put her fork down. "Mr. Stroud." She folded her hands on the table. "You've spent the last 20 minutes establishing that I'm not qualified to be here. I'd like to offer a different framing." She looked around the table. I've worked in pharmaceutical dispensing for 5 years. I've filed 17 compassionate access applications on behalf of patients whose medication costs their families more than I make in 3 months. I know what happens when supply chains prioritize margin over patient outcome because I watch it happen in real time." She paused. "I'm not here because I'm an expert in governance. I'm here because Mr. Galloway needed someone in this room who isn't invested in the outcome." She held Stroud's gaze. "You seem very invested in the outcome." One of the investors, a woman in her 60s named Harriet Bloom, pressed her fingers briefly to her mouth. She might have been suppressing a laugh. Stroud's pleasant expression held, his eyes did not. Bold for a caterer. "Pharmaceutical technician," Cecily said. I've introduced myself twice. I'll give you one more. Prentice's hand, resting near hers on the table, shifted half an inch. The car that followed them out of the parking garage that night wasn't running its headlights. She didn't notice. Prentice did. He said nothing in the moment, but when they pulled to a stop in front of the Yorkville residence, where he'd arranged a guest suite for the engagement, he didn't get out. He sat in the back seat, reading something on his phone, and she was halfway through telling herself she was imagining the tension when the rear window cracked. A sharp impact that split the tinted glass in a jagged line. The driver had the car moving before she understood what she'd heard. "Get down," Prentice said. His voice was entirely flat. She did. She pressed herself sideways on the seat, her shoulder against the leather, and thought with a very specific clarity about all the things she hadn't finished. The prescription auto-refill she'd meant to set up for Bram. The call she hadn't returned on Wednesday because she'd been too exhausted. Prentice's hand came down over her shoulder, not gripping, not urgent, a fixed point. "It's all right," he said. "Keep your head down." The car pulled into a secured underground garage. When they stopped, he got out first, checked something she couldn't see, and then opened her door. He looked at her with a searching intensity she wasn't prepared for. Scanning, methodical, the way she checked off dispensing orders, looking for damage. "I'm fine," she said before he asked. "Your hands are shaking." She looked down. The adrenaline, it'll pass. He held her gaze for another moment. Then he turned, and his voice when he spoke to the driver was cold in a way she hadn't heard from him before. Not angry, colder than anger, the voice of someone finishing a calculation that had already resolved. In the kitchen of the suite, she sat on a stool and drank water and tried to locate the part of herself that was calm. Prentice came in 20 minutes later. His jacket was gone. There was a scrape along his wrist from somewhere. She hadn't seen it happen, and he was pressing a folded cloth to it with complete disregard, the way someone does when they've bled before and have stopped considering it significant. "Sit down," she said. Sit down, please." He sat. She found the first aid kit under the sink, occupational instinct, and cleaned the scrape without ceremony. He watched her hands work and said nothing. "Stroud?" she asked after a moment. "Most likely." He'd do this over a board vote. Prentice was quiet. There's more at stake than a board vote. He said it with a tiredness that sounded structural, like something that went all the way down. "My father spent 20 years building something. Half of what he built is legitimately good. The research programs, the patient access initiatives. Half of what he built I'm still finding in the walls, and I don't love what I find." He looked at the window. "Stroud has been inside the company for 15 years. He wants what's in the walls to stay there." Cecily put the kit away. She stood close enough to see the exhaustion in his face clearly. Not the composed, managed tiredness he wore at meetings, but the real kind, the kind that accumulates in the body like sediment over years. "Why didn't you just hire someone?" she asked quietly, for the liaison role, someone who knew what they were walking into. "Because anyone who knew what they were walking into would have a price." He looked up at her. "You didn't." "I have a price," she said. "Bram's medication." "That wasn't a price. That was a correction." He held her gaze. "You spoke up for Walter Goss before you knew I could offer you anything." She didn't have an answer for that. She looked at the scrape on his wrist, neatly covered now, and thought about the quality of silence in that car. Not performed protection, not theatrical gallantry. Just the instinct to put himself between something and harm. "It was the right thing to do," she said, his own words handed back. His expression fractured very briefly. Then it reassembled, but she'd seen it. He told her it was over on a Tuesday morning, 11 days before the agreement ended. Stroud had resigned from the board the previous evening. Harriet Bloom had shifted her investor block. Cecily would learn later that Bloom had known Stroud for a long time and had been looking for exactly the right reason to act on it. The governance review had been formally withdrawn. A permanent civilian ethics advisory panel, institutional, structured, the real thing, had been announced at a press briefing that morning. Prentice met her in the kitchen of the Yorkville suite. Grey sweater, sleeves pushed up. He looked like someone who had just put down something very heavy after carrying it for a very long time. He set an envelope on the counter between them. "Inside there's the contact information for the patient assistance coordinator," he said. "Bram's next 12 months are covered, and I've spoken with the formulary team about the long-term access pathway." He didn't look at the envelope. He looked at her. "There's also a reference letter. If you want to move into healthcare policy, there are 3 organizations I can introduce you to directly." Prentice. "You should go home." he said. Back to your actual life, your brother. He was quiet for a moment. I know this hasn't been what you... Stroud called me last week, she said. He went very still. Wednesday night. He said you had 3 days before a vote that would remove you from the company entirely. He offered me money to give a statement to the investor group. Something about a conflict of interest in how I was selected. She watched his face. I told him the conflict of interest was his. Prentice stared at her. The muscle in his jaw worked. You didn't tell me. I knew you'd shut it all down if I did. Send me home early, bury it yourself. She tilted her head. Would I have been wrong? He didn't answer, which was the answer. You're not sending me away because the work is done, Cecily said quietly. You're sending me away because now that the threat's gone, you don't have a reason to keep me here that doesn't frighten you. He looked at her. Something in his expression moved, not cracked, not fractured, but opened, the way a window opens and the pressure in a room finally equalizes. I don't ask, he said. I don't do that. I know. She picked up the envelope, looked at it, set it back down. I also know you approved Bram's application before I agreed to anything. I know you sat in that car for 40 seconds after the window cracked because you were doing a risk calculation for my safety, not your own. I know you called Walter Goss directly last week to make sure he still had his job. He was completely still. You're not actually hard to read, she said. You just don't have anyone around who looks. The silence in the kitchen was a different kind from all the others. The gala's silence had been fearful. The boardrooms had been political. This one was simply honest. Prentice Galloway, who had never, in her observation, done anything without deciding to do it first, reached out and covered her hand with his, the way he had in the back of that car. Present. Deliberate. Stay. Nothing else around it. She turned her hand over under his. I already am, she said. He had spent 6 months assembling a company from a wreckage his father had left behind, doing it without flinching, without showing the weight of it, without ever letting anyone close enough to push back when he was wrong. Cecily Ward had walked into his ballroom with a catering tray and her brother's name written somewhere behind her eyes, and she had looked at him the way no one in that room had thought to, not at what he controlled, but at what he was doing with it. She hadn't fixed him, she just refused to pretend she didn't see him. He had spent a very long time surrounded by people who found that arrangement perfectly comfortable. He decided, standing in a Yorkville kitchen at 8 in the morning with her hand turned over in his, that he was done with comfortable.